All right, in this video, let's talk about the People's Republic of China. And technically, this goes from October 1949 to the present. This was established under Chairman Mao Zedong. But let's get some perspective first by looking at a little bit of Chinese history. So prior to 1912, for a couple thousand years, China was ruled by an imperialist dynasty. And this dynastic rule came to an end as a result of an uprising that was beginning in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where there was discontent with the economic situation. A lot of people in China were seeing that they were far behind the rest of the world. They had not industrialized as Europe and the United States were. They also found themselves in a draconian kind of dictatorship where any sort of dissent was met with very harsh punishments. Freedoms were limited. So by 1912, all of this contention kind of emerged and resulted in a new republic being established under a guy by the name of Sun Yat-sen and his Kuomintang Party, KMT for short. This movement was not really a unification of China under a new ruler, but more or less just an elimination of the prior dynasty and a power vacuum for potential new leaders to emerge. Now, Sun Yat-sen certainly had an advantage politically, but militarily, China was still very factioned. You had warlords in various parts of the country, along with foreign entities like the French, the Germans, and the British, that were all vying for more influence in the region. So this environment is one of tension, but also one of collaboration among the different factions to try to form some sort of unified government. But by 1917, things are starting to become more divided because of two events. One is the Russian Revolution, which under Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they are attempting to overthrow over 300 years of Tsarist rule. So many Chinese are influenced by this. They see an opportunity to gain power through an uprising. But the real straw that breaks the camel's back is the May 4th movement in 1919. So World War I effectively ended in 1918, and Germany was the loser, which in turn led to German concessions all over, the world. And some of those concessions were made in China. Remember, Germany had occupied China for many decades prior in various parts. If you visit China, it's kind of odd because in the big cities, you'll be walking around and all of a sudden you feel like you're not in China. Instead, you feel like you're in Germany, or you feel like you're in France, or you feel like you're in Britain, because there was so much foreign occupation there in the 1800s and early 1900s. So the Germans are having to give a lot of this space up because of their losses. The question is, who's going to get it? Well, the allies of the World War I come together and they put together this Treaty of Versailles, which not only formalized what Germany was going to have to do to make amends, but also what was going to happen to those Chinese German holdings. And the agreement was that the Japanese would get some of them. Now, this infuriated many Chinese because the Japanese had already been a thorn in the side of the Chinese. They fought a war back in the 1800s, and there's tension between those two countries that has lasted since. Consequently, the Chinese people, they don't like this. And the nationalist government, the KMT, they're going along with this. They're prepared to sign off on this Treaty of Versailles and hand over these German concessions to the Japanese. That doesn't happen They don't sign the Treaty of Versailles, but the point is this inspires the May 4th movement, because before the treaty is actually signed, there is word of this, and all sorts of chaos breaks out, and it leads to the beginning of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921, the formal beginning of the party. Now, Mao Zedong is a founding member, but he is not the leader of the party at this time. Next thing we see is the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang attempting to unify under Sun Yat-sen's leadership. This may seem difficult in hindsight, but at the time, there were other factions as well, and a unification between these two would have been a very powerful alliance. But that breaks down very quickly and comes to an end when Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, and his successor, Chiang Kai-shek, a military leader, takes over. And his goal is to take control of China. And in turn, that means fighting off the Chinese Communist Party. So he goes to war with them. And this civil war lasts from 1927 to 1949. One very important moment in this battle, however, is 34 to 35. It's known as the Long March. The Kuomintang had gained a stronghold in the south and were in a position to obliterate the communists. But through Mao's leadership, they were able to extricate themselves by walking thousands of miles to the north and regaining their strength. During this long march, Mao effectively solidifies his position as the leader of the Communist Party. It also helped the communist movement because it put them in touch with the smaller, poorer agrarian communities, kind of the peasants of China, which they would need later on to coalesce and get a revolution going. The Communist Party and the Kuomintang stopped fighting during the Japanese invasion from 1937 to 45. In fact, they united to take on the Japanese. And by 1945, the Japanese had lost World War II, and the Chinese were now in a position to go back to fighting internally. And this continues until 1949, where the Communist Party effectively overthrow the Kuomintang, who, under Chiang Kai-shek's leadership, retreat to Taiwan and form the Republic of China. But Mao Zedong forms the People's Republic of China. So remember that, there's a difference. Taiwan is the Republic of China, and China mainland is the People's Republic of China. Also, it's important to note that the Kuomintang are sometimes referred to as the nationalists. So you'll hear about the nationalists retreating to Taiwan. Regardless, Mao now has a stronghold, and it's important to note how he got this. Why was Mao able to very quickly, after the Japanese war ended, overthrow the Kuomintang? And the answer is the Soviet Union, which was being led by Stalin at the time, who provided a lot of support to the Communist Party and Mao, enough support to overpower the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang were getting support for many years from the US and other Western nations, but it wasn't sufficient, and the Soviets had much more zeal to move China towards communism than maybe the US had to get the nationalists in power. Regardless, Mao Zedong is the leader, effective in 1949, of a new nation coalescing under the umbrella of communism. Mao himself was a follower of Marxism, but he was more motivated by the practical application of communism that started by Lenin and was continued and advanced by Stalin in the Soviet Union. Another way to think about it is, these guys here had really been the progenitors of the real world incarnation of communism. Marx just talked about it, right? But these guys actually tried to put it into place, especially Lenin. I mean, he had no model to follow, whereas Stalin just advanced Lenin's model, and Mao, in turn, advanced Stalin's model. Mao was a teacher by trade. He was an intellectual that had very little hands-on military experience, even though he led some of the greatest military expeditions. He didn't have a lot of fighting experience. What we know today of as Maoism is his version of communism. And it involves the uprising of the peasant rather than the urban working class. This is where the Soviets and the Chinese diverge, because remember, the Soviet Union was more industrialized already in 1917, and there was an urban working class that had to be rallied, whereas China is primarily agrarian. There isn't this urban working class, there isn't this industrial class to unify. And as a result, Mao had to adjust to that, because Marx talks about rallying the proletariat worker, right? Whereas Mao is having to deal with these peasants, these, for all intents and purposes, these self-sufficient farmers that they don't work for people, they produce product and they trade it and live off of it. And that's a different beast to deal with. And again, China is a very large area where Mao was going to have to unify people that are spread out over this area, and that meant the peasant class. Ongoing revolution. He believes that capitalism and the forces that propagate capitalism will never cease. Whereas Marx kind of had this idea that capitalism would eventually give way to socialism, and socialism would give way to a communist utopia, and then you're kind of done. You don't have to worry about it anymore. Mao said, no, that's not the case. You always have to battle capitalism, which actually means that a strong leader is very important. That's the primacy of politics. He believed that people can accomplish great things under a great leader. He's famous for saying political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. That'll tell you something right there. His military strategy involved guerrilla warfare. That is, assembling large masses of ordinary people into a battle. These ordinary people are not trained soldiers. If they do have training, it's very limited. But because of the sheer number and the revolutionary fervor that you can cultivate, it can be an effective means of bringing about victory. The downside is the loss of life is usually very high because they're untrained or have limited abilities. Mao is very effective at creating a cult of personality, similar to what Stalin did. And that gives him an almost godlike image in the eyes of his followers. And therefore, they're willing to risk their lives and commit themselves, despite their limited abilities, to revolution. Very few leaders are able to attain that kind of status in the eyes of people. But those that have it often have longevity as leaders compared to those that don't. And Mao ruled for decades until his death in the mid-70s. The cult of personality is also important for reminding people that they need to become communist and no longer economic. He wants to create a selfless person that's capable of self-denial, motivated solely by the benefit of the group. He is rallying people towards a better society that they are just one part of. So the remnants of capitalism for Mao are actually selfish, right? That desire for individualism and private property and forgetting about your larger role in society. He is the representative for society and you should follow him. So he wants to motivate people morally, not materially. And that's going to be really important, because if you're going to take away the incentive that upward mobility and higher income brings, you got to replace it with something. And Mao is replacing it with ideals. All right, that's it for this video. We'll pick up in the next one. Thanks.